I think we can start. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the EGPP seminar series. We have a research seminar today, and we're very fortunate to have our two speakers, Evelyne Hübscher, who is from the Central European University and at the UI this year as Jean Monnet Fellow, and Thomas Sattler, who is at the University of Geneva, and here as a visiting fellow this year. Thank you very much for being with us, for agreeing to give a seminar on voters and the IMF, experimental evidence from European crisis countries. And we agreed that your presentation will take about between 30 and 40 minutes. And then we go straight to Q&A. For those who are here, we are in hybrid mode today. So for those who are in the room, please remember to switch on your mic when you speak and to switch it off when you're not speaking. And for those online, keep the mic off and the video on if you can. If you like to ask questions, please raise your virtual hand, and we will then alternate or try to alternate questions from the room and from those attending online. I think we are all set to start. If you like to share your screen, then the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. I hope you can see my shared screen. So this is joint work together with Thomas Sattler, who is here with us, and Markus Wagner, who is based at the University of Vienna, whom I actually met for the first time when I was doing my PhD at the EUI a long time ago. What we do in this paper is we examine how voters judge the involvement of the IMF when the country needs to implement economic reforms, in particular when it needs to implement fiscal adjustment and austerity. We examined this question in 4 European countries, all of which were at the center of the sovereign debt crisis in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008. And in countries where this austerity process has been assisted by the IMF, or where the IMF was a close partner in facilitating this reform. The paper is part of a larger and broader research agenda, which assesses the political implications of austerity and voters' reaction towards austerity measures. And the starting point really is that austerity measures, by and large, are politically contentious, right? As some of the scholars who work here at the center, like Hans-Peter Presi and his entourage or team also have shown, and not very popular with voters. Just to illustrate these 2 points, I begin the talk with some empirical evidence. Let me see, on the micro and the macro level. What you see here is a piece of evidence that is part of a paper that we've published in the British Journal of Political Science recently. And in this paper, we exposed respondents to different scenarios of what governments are doing when they face an economic crisis and high levels of public deficit. In particular, we mentioned in the scenario that the government is implementing cuts in spending, public and social spending. Another scenario mentioned that in the light of this crisis, the government is increasing taxation. And in the third scenario, we indicated the government is doing nothing despite this dire economic situation. What you see from your side on the left panel, right, is the average approval by respondents who were exposed to a certain scenario. And we see that in particular, spending cuts are very much disliked. So the scale on our y-axis goes from 1 to 5 overall, where 1 indicates strong disapproval of such a measure, and 5 would be high, very high approval, right? So spending cuts are really disliked quite a bit, followed by tax increases, and still people are not satisfied when the government is doing nothing either. On the right-hand side panel, we ask voters or respondents whether or not they would vote for the government after the government has implemented such a scenario. And again, you see that more than 3/4 of the respondents who were exposed to a scenario in which the government announces to implement spending cuts decide not to vote for the government in the next election. So what you see here just are the pooled results of all the 5 countries that were in which we fielded these experiments. And over by and large, I think the evidence in these countries, if we separate and disentangle the countries, are the same. To complement this picture, I show you that governments actually know about this and are reluctant to implement austerity and fiscal consolidation defined as either cuts in spending or tax increases. This is from another paper in the European Journal of Political Research, which covers 16 industrialized democracies over a period of roughly 13 years. So we have a time series cross-section data set. Our key or our dependent variable operationalizes consolidation as 0 in a country year where there was no consolidation implemented, and 1 in a country year where there was consolidation, right? Here we are really interested in how different types of government deal with this pressure to implement consolidation. And we differentiate between governments who have a large margin of victory or a lot of electoral support. And this is measured as their advantage over the key opponent in the opposition. So a government with a large margin of victory has roughly 16 percentage points more in terms of electoral support than its opponent in the opposition. And as it is indicated by the green line, and this is 1 standard deviation above the mean support, right? Just to frame this better. And you see over the electoral cycle, which is plotted on the x-axis from year 1 after the election up to year 5 after the election, a government who enjoys quite a bit of support, right, has a probability that equals roughly 30% throughout the whole electoral cycle to engage in any sort of unpopular reform, fiscal austerity. However, if you have a government with a very small margin of victory of just 2 percentage points more than his key opponent in the opposition, his key competitor, you see that this likelihood really drops quite significantly throughout the electoral cycle, right? And this difference becomes markable up after the second year within the electoral cycle. So I guess this is really a sign that this is no piece of cake, right, to engage in unpopular reforms, and that governments are quite reluctant, which is for good reasons, right? Nevertheless, I think there are instances like the sovereign debt crisis where governments really do not have a choice, and they need to implement such costly, potentially electorally dangerous reform, right? So what we ask in this paper is really, what can governments do when they are trapped between markets who require or expect them to implement serious reforms and voters who generally dislike such events? So how can governments, in a way, increase the public support for unpopular policies, right? And how do external actors, such as the IMF in particular, right, and together with Troika during the sovereign debt crisis, how do such interventions affect the approval of fiscal adjustment? So these are the key questions which frame this paper. So now there has been quite a bit of work on how the IMF is seen and how it intervenes in domestic policy making, sort of, but most of this work is centered at the macro level. Yeah, what we try to do here is take this down to the micro level and try to tease out how voters perceive this and how the IMF presence frames their reaction towards austerity. So the voter perspective on IMF involvement in our view, has two sides. So IMF interventions in general put governments between a rock and a hard place, if you wish, right? And they confront them with the trade-off, on the one hand, that the IMF can lend them some credibility, the IMF can lend them some the perspective of efficiency or effectiveness, and economic stabilization, right? But on the other hand, the IMF also signals a loss, or IMF involvement also signals a loss of control, some loss of autonomy over core policy areas that really shape the makeup of a domestic economy, right? And what we are interested in is to see what the voter's position and her preferences are in all of this. And we propose that the involvement of the IMF can affect voters' perspective in two ways. On the one hand, they can take an efficiency or effectiveness perspective or lens, right? And they say, hey, yes, that's great, yeah. So with the IMF involvement, we will be back on the track of economic prosperity sooner. On the other hand, voters can also say, well, it's actually not so great. A lot of the decisions that I really care of are taken out of the government's hand, and we face a loss of sovereignty, a loss of accountability. Yeah. So these are, in a way, the two different perspectives, or the trade-off that voters face. Yeah. And again, we would propose what speaks in favor of the first perspective is that, on average, voters cherish economic stability, and they have an interest in bringing back the economy on a good track, because dire economic situations threatens their jobs, they threaten the benefits they may receive, and so on and so forth, right? And by resorting to the IMF, the government can signal not only to the market and potential creditors that they have a real interest in fixing the situation. They tie their hands in a way by accepting conditions which really help the economy, right? They maybe also forgo to some sort of political benefits in the future because they cannot turn the situation into their advantage anymore. Yeah, and all of this should meet the approval of the voter. That would be the positive side. On the negative side, IMF interventions can be seen or portrayed as resorting to technocratic governance and government, right? You find solutions outside of the domestic political discourse, which means that the accountability and responsiveness mechanisms which sort of shape political competition in a country, and which is something that voters really think dearly of, is hampered or doesn't function, at least during a limited period of time, right? So the intervention of the IMF reduces political competition and takes out key decisions from the electoral arena, which can instill a feeling of loss of sovereignty, loss of control, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that leads us to the following hypotheses. So we have this efficiency mechanism where we propose that voters are more optimistic that fiscal adjustment measures are efficient and really resolve the current crisis if the IMF is on board, yeah, than in a case where the IMF is not on board. To contrast this, we have the sovereignty mechanism or perspective, which proposes that voters are more likely to perceive austerity as going against their will, and which instills a perception or a feeling of loss of sovereignty, loss of autonomy. Right. These two mechanisms have opposite have an opposite effect, right? Whereas the first one boosts the level of approval, the second one diminishes or reduces, which leads to an overall impact. So if the effectiveness mechanism dominates, voters are more likely to approve of fiscal adjustments when the IMF is on board as when it is not on board. If the sovereignty mechanism dominates, voters are less likely to approve of fiscal adjustment when the IMF is on board than when it is not on board. Yeah. Before I enter into the discussion or provide you with detailed information about the empirical setup of our experimental design, I just would like to provide you with some background information on the bailout packages, the austerity, and the conditionalities imposed on the 4 countries. As you can see on the left, this is simply a table that sort of gives you an idea how massive these bailout packages or loans were, yeah, and how much the EU contributed as opposed to the IMF. You probably see that in Spain, the loan came only from the EU, but the IMF was an important partner in this process. And in particular, before the EU agreed to provide a loan to Spain, the IMF, or a potential involvement of the IMF, was really part of the public discourse. And the loan or the demand from Spain to get such a loan came right after the IMF published a damaging report on the state of the Spanish economy. So in a way, the IMF was looming in the background and was essential to facilitate this process, really. Yeah. The last column shows the austerity that has been implemented throughout this this period, expressed as percentage points of a country's GDP, right? So in the case of Greece, this is huge. Yeah. Spain had the smallest, if you wish, share of austerity, but still above 10 percentage points, right? Which is a lot. And then we have Portugal and Ireland in between. On the right-hand side, you see the conditionalities attached to these loans. And they're soft and hard conditions. In IMF language, hard conditions are conditions on the policies that need to be implemented, which do not allow, where the IMF puts a lot of weight on. So these are measures, policies that really need to be implemented, right? In the domestic sphere, there is no more wiggle room or room to discussion. Soft conditions, well, the IMF puts less weight on them, and I think they can still be shaped and within the domestic realm. And again, you see that Greece had the highest share of hard conditions attached, whereas Ireland the lowest share of hard conditions attached. For Spain, we do not have this measure because indeed the loan came from the EU, and the data where I got this from does not cover Spain. We tried to replicate this using the memorandum of understandings and code this in the light of the type of conditions that were that Spain had to apply or comply with. Here, just to another picture that shows how the breadth of the comprehensiveness of the type of policy measures that these states had to implement. Here in absolute numbers, so you can see that Greece by far had the most policy measures to implement. If you take the absolute number, it was over 400 policies over various domains, right? Whereas Ireland and Portugal had significantly less, and they didn't touch upon all domains. I will not go into much detail. I just would like to point the finger at two things. The first, the biggest bar, this light sort of pink, is related to issues how the external debt is managed. Yeah, so a lot of regulatory policy changes and so on and so forth. And the bar which shows in a darker red affect the policy domain of taxes and fiscal adjustments. So really at the core of how a government again shapes and regulates its economy, whether it increases taxes, whether it reduces spending. And these are very, very prominent areas, right? And just to, and all countries had hard conditions on reducing the deficit, on reducing pay, on for public servants or hiring freezes, public investment, and so on and so forth, right? Other measures are more related to flexibilization of labor markets, privatizations of state-owned industries, and so on and so forth. But that just gives you a flavor of how comprehensive these measures are, right? And also a bit about the differences. Okay. Now on to the survey. So the way we designed our survey is really in line with other people who have investigated public opinion on foreign policies. And we face the issue that if we really want to get at the impact the IMF has on public opinion, we need to compare, in a way, a adjustment episode where the IMF was on board with an adjustment episode where the IMF was not on board. And using observational data, we cannot do this, right? We don't really have two cases that were identical, and so on and so forth. So what we do is we resort to a survey experiment, and which allows us to sort of identify and differentiate between these different mechanisms by manipulating or presenting respondents to different scenarios. So our key treatment is whether or not the IMF has been present or not, right? So one part of the respondents see a scenario. All of these scenarios allude to the fact that the government really is in deep trouble and is facing a huge deficit, right? One part of the respondents see a scenario where the IMF is involved. The other see a scenario where the IMF is not involved. Then we also sort of vary other dimensions, which may co-vary with the fact whether the IMF is present or not. On the one hand, government partisanship, right? There might be people who say, well, a right-wing government or a conservative government is more likely to get the IMF on board as opposed to a left-wing government, or the IMF is on board only when the size of adjustment is large, or when the crisis is large as opposed to when the size of adjustment is relatively small, or the crisis is light, yeah? Then we measure the outcome. Our key outcome measure is the level of approval, policy approval. So to what extent respondents approve of a policy trajectory chosen by the country, yeah? And we measure this on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 indicates, oh, I completely disapprove, whereas 10 indicates, oh, I'm really on board with this. And we also look at vote intentions, though this will not be part of the results that I present here today. The mediators, so the two mechanisms which I presented, the efficiency mechanisms, we get at this by assessing to what extent respondents think that the measure taken will resolve the crisis. And the sovereignty perspective is taken up by a question whether or not people think the government was free to choose its own course or to design its own solution in that situation. I think I forgot to mention, right, the countries are clear. We were working together with Ipsos, and the survey has been fielded in August 2020, if I remember correctly. On to the key results. So what you see here, this is the key treatment effect. Just a description of how the level of approval differs across between the two groups. The one that saw a scenario in which the IMF was on board, and the other one that saw a scenario in which the IMF was not on board. And on average, we see that there is a difference, and people approve of such unpopular reforms or adjustments more if the IMF is on board. Of course, there is variation across the countries, right? So we see that in Ireland, people approve, the level of approval is quite a bit higher with the IMF on board than without having the IMF on board. And in Greece, there is hardly any difference, yeah? And this is this is confirmed by running a more formal or more rigorous model, let's say. Yeah, this is these are the coefficients of the key treatment. So the IMF on approval, our main effect, and the overall effect in the pooled model is positive. So meaning that yes, the IMF increases approval ratings. Yeah, and we see these differences. Where Greece clearly not significant. Yeah, the IMF, whether or not the IMF is on board, makes no difference. Spain and Ireland in particular, yeah, seems to be very fond of the IMF. Spain less so, and Portugal is at the brink of being significant, or actually not. Yeah. Now let's look at these mediating effects, at these two opposing mechanisms and how they contribute in explaining our main effect. What you see here on the left is the effectiveness perspective. And here you see for our pool model, indeed, voters seem to approve the policy because they believe that a package that is demanded by the IMF will be more effective in resolving the crisis than if the IMF were not present. So the average causal mediation effect of effectiveness is about 0.1, right? And this effect explains roughly 40% of our main effect. Yeah. When we move on to the sovereignty perspective, as expected, this effect is negative. Yeah. So indeed, people seem to have the impression that that IMF involvement has a negative effect on a country's autonomy and will lead to a loss of sovereignty, at least temporarily, right? But the effect is weaker, and it contributes 14% of the overall explanation of the main effect. So even if we have this negative effect on the sovereignty mechanism or perspective, it is not big enough to counterweight the overall positive effect of the efficiency mechanism. To conclude, so it seems that indeed IMF interventions increase the popular approval of fiscal adjustment, but voters' responses vary across countries. Yeah, and it is really this part where we aim, or where we are currently working on putting a little bit more meat on the bones and provide country narratives to contextualize these differences that we find. Voters do expect that measures are more effective with the IMF, but there are concerns about sovereignty decrease. Yeah, but our effectiveness mechanism still dominates. I already mentioned that we are currently in the process of working a little bit more on the country narratives, right? To see why the Ireland, for example, reacted more positively to this. And I just know from anecdotal evidence that, for example, the president of central bank was talking very, very positively about the IMF and gave exactly the type of reasons that we would expect why they took the IMF on board. Whereas in Greece, obviously the discourse was more negative, and overall it was a much more complicated process. What we are also doing at the moment in the future is explore subgroup heterogeneity more, right? So what I presented you here were just the average effects across all respondents. So what we would like to tease out really is whether the sovereignty effect or perspective is more dominant among specific parties and groups, right? Or whether the effectiveness belief or perspective is linked to specific socioeconomic backgrounds, for example. And these are things that we are currently working on. So thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. And
thank you. Thank you, Evelyne, very much for your presentation. We go straight to Q&A, and maybe you would like to leave. Oh no, okay. In case someone would like to refer back to the slides, but we can always come back to them.
Stop sharing, but if someone has a question on particular slides, I can put them on. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Thank you. So we can go to Q&A. Yes, please. I don't know your name. I'm sorry.
Sorry, my name is Arthur Schramm. Yeah, so my question is the following. You introduce a survey experiment with hypothetical situations, which I understand and you're motivated. But then I don't really understand why this has to be held in countries where they've actually experienced these measures with the IMF. If I think of a country like Greece, I can imagine that just the emotion of what they experienced affects your results, for example. And why not just choose a different set of countries?
This is a good question. Thanks a lot. So, and I think we take you complement my answers, right? So one reason is why we wanted to keep the context in a way stable. So these countries have a comparable trajectory due to their embeddedness in the EU, right? And we thought that it would be difficult to, for example, contrast Ireland with Argentina, Argentina, who had frequent IMF intervention. So that was I think one key reason. And we also thought that people need to be able to associate something with the IMF or be aware of the type of discourse or discussions that are linked to that. Of course, that raises the question of pre-treatment, because in a way, the discussions are divided different across these countries. But in the end, I think our rationale that we wanted to have a shared context dominated. You want to add something, Thomas?
Yeah, I just want to add that there's a trade-off, right? So we could have, if we run this experiment in Germany, that would be very unrealistic. So there is no indication that the IMF would ever intervene there. So there's a trade-off between realism and to what extent that makes sense to people, what we ask them, and to what extent they have prior beliefs on what the IMF does and to what extent the IMF helps or not. So we think, and that's why we chose these countries, we think that it must be realistic enough for people to actually answer this survey in a meaningful way. And that's the case in countries that have seen the IMF. Now, having most countries that see the IMF today, often they have prior experience, like Argentina, right? The IMF comes in there all the time. And the question now is, to what extent in this context does the IMF help to sell the reforms or not? And this depends on the legitimacy, and the legitimacy again depends on what they have experienced and what they believe the IMF will do, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's the point here. But and you're totally right, they have totally different beliefs, but it's not the case that they all have bad beliefs about what the IMF does, as we see in the case of Ireland, right? At least not the majority, right? These are average effects. So there are certain people who clearly don't like what the IMF does and did and would do. But that's a trade-off. But that's exactly the purpose that we want to see, given your experience. So given your pre-treatment situation, how do people actually vary in their assessment? And we can only do that if they understand what the IMF have a belief what the IMF actually does and what it does to them.
I have Elizabeth Huge next.
Thanks, Evelyne and Thomas, for a really interesting paper here. I second the point. And I understand your responses, and I think the idea of real-world experience is quite compelling. But I still fear, I think, alongside with you, that you're introducing this potentially very confounding factor of real world experience that also varies hugely across your 4 cases. Probably gives you a handle on why Greece really doesn't pan out one way or another, right? So if you have plans to do a follow-up, one could think of 2 things. One is to go back to these countries and ask questions on a personal experience with the specific IMF in implication there. And given that's relatively recent, I think that could still be fresh in people's minds. If it's not, then you have something to play with. There may be a variable there. And I would particularly go to not only the cognitive, what they remember and what specifics, but also the emotional elements, and I would try to kind of probe that and get that terrain for the 4 countries or for a subset that you have. The other would be, depending on your resources, is to go to countries where, and picking up on Thomas's point of this got to be realistic in people's mind, to go to countries that potentially could be candidates like Italy or Belgium, but haven't been recently enough so that it's in people's mind freshly. And there, replay the experiment. That might be a thing. That was not really what I wanted to say. I'll have to be quick because I was wondering about the mediator's effectiveness and sovereignty. And I didn't quite get how you operationalize that. I would just like to hear more about this. One. And second, do you have separate items that estimate preferences on attitudes towards the IMF or more generally attitudes towards international governance? Because that might be a factor driving some of the preferences that you pick up. I'm just going to leave it there.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so this is a hard nut to crack, I think. I'm intrigued by the idea to get at the reasoning, yeah, of why people develop certain preferences or indicate certain preferences. And I also and to feel the survey in a country that is at the brink of getting or was in situations where it was closed does make sense. So we need to check the resources side, yeah, to see whether we can cover at least part of this, yeah. The mediating effects, the question that captures our sovereignty dimension, we specifically asked people to what extent they think the government was free to choose or was free in taking their own decisions, yeah. The efficiency question or effectiveness was phrased in a way that people had to indicate to what extent they believe that this measure will resolve the crisis. So it is changing or oscillating between efficiency and credibility, I'd say, yeah.
Just to clarify why I'm asking it, I just would like to be more convinced that there is no endogeneity here between your chief independent variable and the dependent variables.
If we had done it, how? I mean, so we specifically followed the causal mediation papers that Toms and Weeks and Mattes and Weeks have done. So they usually, there's a scenario, right? And there's an announcement of the IMF, of the prime minister that says we're going to do austerity. And in one case, that's it. And in the other one, they say it's because of the IMF, this is a condition of the IMF. And then we ask them follow-up questions. One is, do you approve of that? And the other one is, do you think the government was free? Do you think this resolves the crisis, et cetera, et cetera? So you think there's an endogeneity problem here between, I mean, these are simply different follow-up questions, where one is the final outcome, which is the approval, and the other two are actually, what do you think how this affects other aspects like national sovereignty?
Well, I just others may want to come in on this and have a different take. Just it's not so much between the independent variable but it is actually between the mediators, which are attitudes vis-a-vis, the perceptions on how the IMF affects things, and then approval of essentially the reform, right? So, and that's where I wonder whether between the dependent variable and the mediators, there's actually, the distance is too close. They're too proximate to each other, is another way of putting it.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Do you have a suggestion what we should do here, or how we should check that?
Not off the top of my head, but I'll think about it.
Okay.
Just on, yes, we do have questions that get at the preference or at international governance and trust in these institutions. Yeah, yeah. And I think we do control for that, but we are still in the process of finding a final model. But that would be part of the descriptives in the paper.
Can I just add something here? So yes, that's the trust in IOs, and that's one thing we will do. I think we can do more here in terms of to right voters, to left voters, to extremist voters. I mean, this is going in the same direction, that if you're a radical right voter, you would be less trustful, or you care more about sovereignty, you don't trust the international organizations, you don't want to have them any power, etc., etc. So that's something we will definitely exploit. That's the next step. What we did not do, and that's a bit unfortunate, that we did not here distinguish between the cultural dimension and the economic dimension. I think we do the economic dimension, we do the general left-right, but we do not have the cultural dimension. And in retrospect, we find that a bit unfortunate. If we had that, we could actually disentangle this even more. But that's not what we have. But we do have economic dimension, and we do have general left-right, and that's what we're going to play with.
Okay, thank you. Gary Marks, next on the list.
Yeah, this is an interesting discussion, and my question kind of comes at this from just a different angle, but it arrives at the same sort of questions, really. And that is, you're dealing with a topic that may be quite distant from people's cognitive understanding in two ways. I mean, one, they may lack the economic logic. I mean, you quoted from a banker. I mean, these people kind of understand, debate these things. How much the general public understands, or individuals with them, there's going to be some variance there. And then simply it seems a little bit like some kind of cognitive knowledge test. And so immediately that puts the spotlight on the way in which you pose the items. What information do you give? I mean, this is going to be very important. And then when individuals are asked about issues that are not on the top of their head, or which are distant from their experience, with which they are unfamiliar, the finding in us on a variety of issues, not least attitudes over European integration, is that they fall back on things that are firmly in their gut. And what are those things that are in their gut? Well, their partisanship. So so when you turn around and say, look, we want to get at the reasoning, I think this is exciting. Because, how do people actually reason about these things? And what we, found with respect to attitudes over economic integration in Europe was that, it wasn't easy for individuals to figure out how they stood, but rather they did know how they stood on issues of national identity and the extent to which they had exclusive national identity and so forth. And the same thing actually applies to analyses of attitudes over trade. There's a whole set of economic arguments that can be tested, but that's not actually how people think about it. And so, I'd really urge you to try to probe, to get inside people's heads to some extent. This will vary. I'm sure that some individuals are really going to understand the question. They'll know what the IMF is. They'll say it's the International Monetary Fund, and they can even, but the proportion of individuals that can do that is going to vary across those countries. And I think that's really, it's going to be really interesting for you to kind of get inside people's motivations and their heads on this.
Yeah, I think I do agree. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Just within brackets, I don't come from an individual level necessarily, Soviet literature or approach to political science questions. And I mean, these are to what extent people really understand, right? The type of scenarios that we present them with is something that I often wonder myself when I work on these surveys, right? And it's a difficult question to answer. Yeah, I mean, the reasoning is one avenue, and definitely one that currently sees a lot of support and popularity. Yeah, because I think we made a step forward, but by getting at the mechanisms, which is already something that is not necessarily part of prior research. Yeah, but it would definitely be more convincing or improve to feel if we would have more about what's happening.
Do you tell them what the IMF is? I mean, do you assume that people know about the IMF? I mean, some people will, obviously, but that may be a portion of those respondents. And I suppose the argument might be, well, these people will be kind of random in their response, so you'll pick up the people who have the cognitive knowledge to actually figure out what you're asking.
We do mention what the IMF is and what they do, yeah, in the enter screens to the people to the respondents who are exposed to the IMF scenario. Yeah, if I have this.
Yeah, maybe I can step in here. So because I've got it here in front of me in the paper. So they go through various screens of background information. So we say, here's some background information. The country has experienced a strong or mild or very strong or a moderate increase in public debt. The debt level is troubling. The government is finding it very difficult or extremely difficult to borrow money. So there's the description of a crisis. Yes, here it is, right? And then the prime minister says that spending cuts are necessary. And it says that we have they are moderate spending cuts or very strong spending cuts, and for some there's this screen that actually this addition that says these were a condition of the IMF, and then we describe the IMF is an international organization that provides emergency loans to countries in crisis, but only to governments who commit to carry out certain reforms. So we do tell them a bit to anchor. So the setup is fairly precise to anchor their beliefs as far as we can. So yes, that's what we do. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't still have some variation how they see these things. So that's certainly true. But I think what matters here is, and that's actually an argument in favor of doing it in countries that have experienced these things. Because if you do that in a country that has never talked about the IMF, then the heterogeneity on what people associate with the IMF will be even wider, I think. So I think that's an argument why we do it in these countries that we chose. That doesn't mean that they don't have different beliefs, but I think that's the fact that even if they don't know much about the economic mechanisms, doesn't mean that they wouldn't have beliefs. So, and I think we're trying to get at least some of these beliefs. Do they believe that it's actually helpful? Do spending cuts help? And do they work better if the IMF is there or not? Is it more important that the IMF is actually politically troubling from a democratic point of view? So we're not covering all the beliefs that I think are out there, but I think we're trying to get at some beliefs which we find central. But I agree that we need to do more in terms of voter heterogeneity and which groups believe what, which groups believe which part of the story, and which groups believe the other part of the story. So certainly there is a lot of room which we haven't exploited yet.
We have a a list of speakers, but it's reasonably long, and so everyone will have plenty of time. I would like to go online now and give the floor to Adrienne Héritier. Adrienne, if you unmute yourself.
Yes, thanks very much for this highly interesting presentation. I have just a question regarding the second mechanism, referring to the research, of the negotiations in Portugal. That's now for the research of Catherine Moury and others. It came out that actually there was quite a lot of negotiation space for the government, which means that, this rigid choice, first of all, is maybe not as a harsh choice as you maybe assume. And secondly, it's certainly completely shrouded in secrecy, what the government is, how it is talking about, what is talking to IMF and Troika, in the case now of this research of Catherine Moury. So how would voters that possibly know?
Thank you.
So the question is, how would voters know what has been part of the discussions between the IMF, the Troika, and the government, right? I think at the time, the only source of information they had was what was out in the media. And I think, given that our survey has been fielded in long after this process, people would factor in the way the recovery process evolved and how successful or not this process has been. And I think that would really make up their view, right? I don't think that, yeah. So when I mentioned during the talk that we are about to flesh out more the country narratives, right? And the work by Moury and her various co-authors is exactly on the list of getting a better sense of what the country went through, not only in the moment of crisis, but also in the aftermath, and how that has played out in the electoral arena and in the party discourse, which is at the moment really missing largely in the paper. But a relevant point and the direction that we will move further. Do you want to add?
Just a little thing. I think the framing of the government can vary what they say about the IMF. Like, we were a hard negotiator and we got the most out of our country, or it's more, oh, we had to do this, and they do more the scapegoat version of that. So I think our paper is more in the scapegoat logic. That's the starting point that where we think like the government says, okay, we have no, the IMF just imposes that on us, rather than we play hardball with the IMF. But the question how the government can message this is important, but it's kind of a different question here. We would need to add another treatment here. So I think we are in the framing. The IMF imposes that on us, and we leave it there, right? So that's what the treatment says, and then that's. But that doesn't mean that there's more going on. But we think this is a bit beyond what we can do in this paper.
But just a very brief note. So the Irish, they were selling the IMF in a very positive light. I just have a quote from the central bank president. He mentioned that they sold the intervention of the IMF as the IMF providing protection to Ireland, for Ireland, from the vagaries of the international financial markets, right? And I think it would be good to have similar sort of anecdotal evidence how the government or important influential actors talked about that moment and sort of justified the reason why they resorted or why they chose this way or had to go down this route. Yeah, and I think that very much goes in that direction.
Simon Hicks.
Thanks. Evelyne, Thomas, really interesting project. I have a couple of questions. First one relates to what you've just been talking about. The second one's completely separate. I'm not sure what we can really take away from the aggregate level results, apart from the fact that we find that Ireland likes the IMF and Greece doesn't, which we kind of knew anyway. So, I think of what really is driving this is not your experimental design, it's the context. And it's the context not just of the austerity, it's the context of what came afterwards, and the perception in Ireland, this was a success, and the perception in Greece, this was a disaster. So you're kind of throwing in an experiment where people see IMF and it triggers, oh, this kind of worked. I remember the IMF did the stuff and it was a success. Yeah, I like the IMF. And the opposite in Greece. So I think a lot of what you should do next is try and think about what were the distributional consequences of the context. What happened in Ireland? What happened in Greece? What happened in Spain? What happened in Portugal? Who are the winners and losers distributionally? And then use that to drive what you do with your heterogeneous effects. So you could look at the kind of, you'd expect certain people to respond differently to the IMF in Ireland than would in Greece. So it's not just aggregate heterogeneous effects, it's heterogeneous effects within each of the contexts. That might give you more leverage to try and understand what's going on here, because the distributional consequences in Greece were largely age-related. The distributional consequences in Ireland, I'm not sure, I don't know it so well. So I think really do more to uncover and think about how that context is particularly playing out, because the context seems to be driving everything at the moment. The second question, and this relates a little bit, Thomas, to your talk yesterday that I was thinking about, is austerity. I find austerity problematic because there's a whole bunch of stuff going on underneath what austerity means. In particular, austerity that means cuts in public spending, and austerity which means raising taxes. And they're very different things politically. They're very different. Is there any way you can do anything with what was going on in terms of how austerity was applied in the different contexts and what that meant? Because in Ireland, I seem to remember it was largely related to tax increases and the effect on wages as well as cuts. In Greece, it was overwhelmingly cuts, right? So I mean, and there were huge cuts in the public sector in Ireland. I mean, salaries were dropped by like 40% in the public sector. So I mean, very, very different context in terms of how austerity played out. But anyway, those are my sort of thoughts.
Yes, so we definitely need to look into these subgroup heterogeneity and how different voters or respondents react towards this trade-off, right? And to do this, or to sort of introduce the distributional consequences of these harsh measures would be a very good motivating or starting point to do this. Yeah, it's tricky, I think, because or empirically tricky to really link this, but it's worth a shot, I think. When it comes to the austerity, to how austerity played out, often it's driven or dominated by spending cuts. I think when we look into the data that we leverage in the macro work, in country level work, we use Alesina's data and Jeffries and co-authors from the IMF. So they really provide relatively fine-grained information on the tax component and the spending component. And in most countries, the spending component is dominating. Yeah. So there is one caveat for Greece is not included either in the Alesina data set, nor is it included in the former or previous data provided by the IMF. So what I presented you here with is really from IMF reports and policy documents, but we do not have this more finely grained measure. What I know is that, in particular in Greece, some of the restructuring or austerity measures went through consumption taxes or an increase in VAT, an increase on taxes on alcohol and tobacco, and so on and so forth. That was less the case, for example, in Spain, which was not part of the IMF program, where all of these mostly apply to the financial sector, but less so in Portugal. Yeah, but to get at the distribution of consequences is a very is a good point, and to provide a little bit more on how austerity really played out, at least either in the paper or in the appendix, to get a better flavor of this is also worth taking up.
Can I just add a few things? There is I think the aggregate results do tell us something interesting, which is the IMF is actually not perceived as bad as it's often portrayed in the literature. I think there's a large literature that says if the IMF comes in, it's politically more disastrous. I give you an example. So in the paper, and maybe I shouldn't say this because Hans-Peter is not here, but the paper I alluded to yesterday that Hans-Peter wrote on how austerity reduces public support for governments, they have an interaction effect with the IMF, whether the IMF is there or not, and if the IMF is there, it actually gets worse. So the government is actually punished more if the IMF comes in. And there's other observational studies that show similar things. And the point here is that we believe that in these papers, the IMF it's actually not the effect of the IMF, it's the effect of the situation, which is particularly bad if the IMF comes in. And that's what we show here is that holding the situation constant, you add the IMF or not. At least that's what we're trying in this experiment. And then you don't see that the IMF is making things worse. It does raise questions about sovereignty, and that's often the argument that it's getting worse because the government giving up control. And that's true. But there's another part of the story which actually counteracts this loss. And I think so that's what the aggregate results show us, that these observational studies don't pick up the effect of the IMF, or not exclusively, but to a large degree the situation that is worse when the IMF comes in. I think that's one aspect that but I agree that we should make this clearer in our paper. The other one is, what is austerity? So yes, so in previous works, we did cuts and tax increases. Here we deliberately then did not do that. It's just about spending cuts. And we say, for instance, pensions, healthcare, education, and public transport. Just to anchor that a bit, that does not answer the question like, yes, in Greece, the package was different than in Ireland. That's fine. That's the bunch chuck it out piece that looks at the composition of austerity and how that how support varies with that. So I think that's important. But then we would have different packages plus the IMF, etc., which messes around with a lot of this. We simplified it, which makes it very simplistic. But I think we're pointing to the key component of each package, which is a large spending cut across the board. I think that's the idea here.
Okay, next is.
Say again. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
But there's a difference between when you look at the heterogeneous effects in aggregate pooled across all four cases and whether you look at the heterogeneous effects individually within each of the cases. I would suggest the latter, given how much the context is driving what you're doing.
Yeah, I agree.
We can move to Ruth Dassonville.
Yeah, thanks for that presentation. Really interesting. I've got two points. The first one is you related to the fact that you want to do a bit more with the context. The thought I had there was that it would be really cool if you can get some use coverage text analysis and then have a sentiment analysis and sort of what is the average tone across those four countries that is associated with coverage about the IMF. And if the data allows, it would be really neat if you can use sort of that to connect to individual level heterogeneity as well. If you have some information about how sort of informed people are, or how much your respondents access political information, you could plausibly make the argument that those who look for a lot of news coverage or political coverage, we're more exposed to that tone of the IMF, and then do something that if you have indicators on that at all. The second point I had relates to the control of the national government, mediation and that path. And I think it's a really plausible path. I'm not entirely sure that your measure is the best possible measure for it. And my sort of concern was that it almost seems like a manipulation check question. Half of your respondents gets information that explicitly says this package, that it is a condition by the IMF to get funding for it. And they hence should sort of, it makes total sense and almost like a manipulation. Did they notice that there was something about the IMF in the vignette? If they do, then they should realize, well, the IMF is imposing a condition, meaning my national government has less control, rather than something else. And just, did you see the vignette or not? Thanks.
So yes, for the first, so the news coverage is a good one. So I would need to think. So how would you then how would you frame the question that gets at sovereignty without sort of making it a potential manipulation technique? Because what you say sort of makes sense. Yeah, it is. Yeah. I never thought about this from this perspective, yeah, but it could well be, yeah.
Do you have data on how long they spent on that screen?
We have that for blockwise, not after every, right? Not after every single question they answer, but for blocks of question. That, yes, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I would really need to consider this, to think about this in more depth. Yeah, a good point. No.
And Martin Fink.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting paper. I wanted to come back to a couple of things that are already discussed, 2 points. So the first point on disentangling the IMF from other international institutions, or to rephrase this, is this a paper about the IMF or about the impact of international institutions? I was thinking about this specifically in the case of Portugal, that was already mentioned by Adrian. Since in Portugal, all the talk was about the Troika. So in the news, you never see references to the IMF, right? It's always the Troika. And so, yeah, this also goes to your design, right? That was already mentioned, I think, but just to push you on this. So even in this scenario that you give to respondents where there's no IMF involved, as soon as you talk about austerity, they will assume, I think, that the IMF is involved, because why otherwise would the government push for austerity if it is not external actors, right? And so, yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Even in that scenario where you don't mention the IMF, they will probably assume that the EU is involved and maybe the World Bank, and I think probably also the IMF, and that will of course differ depending on the actual experience in the context that people may have had, right? So we go back to the past experience, but yeah, I wanted to push this point because I think that's important, and I think this in general is a question, of course, about international institutions, right? And a practical point there is, did you also vary in your scenarios with regard to whether the EU is involved or the World Bank, or whether it is only the IMF? So whether that's something that you could do with, could play with. So I'm not exactly So I think you could, that relates to the pitch of the paper, right? Why do you focus specifically on the IMF and not on international institutions? Would actually allow you maybe to generalize the scope of your argument. But in the particular case of Portugal, for example, and it is maybe the same in Greece, yeah, I'm not exactly sure that your design manages to tease this apart. Second point, maybe more general, about your, in a way, your counterfactual scenario, right? So in those scenarios where the IMF is not involved, basically you, that's a scenario where the government is pushing for austerity, but without international institutions. And yeah, to what extent does that actually make sense, right? Because why do governments actually push for austerity, right? By definition, because there is some external pressure. They don't like to do this because, of course, the voters don't like it, right? So by definition, this whole austerity question, it goes maybe a bit to what Simon was saying. The whole notion of austerity, of course, is also linked, I think, to international involvement, right? So that also means that when you put it to respondents, it's very difficult to disentangle this. But even in the counterfactual scenario, I'm not exactly sure how I would interpret this, right? So what exactly does it mean that governments push for austerity without international institutions involved? So just to push you still a bit on some of these issues.
Thanks. We did not change the type of international institution involved. So we only specifically mentioned the IMF. I think our reasoning was that we wanted to speak to a broader audience and not just highlight the EU, yeah, which in a way goes against the point why we then didn't widen the set of countries that we look at. But our reading and reasoning was really that in our perception, the IMF was a prominent figure, and a lot of the prescriptions that were imposed or then implemented sort of were influenced by the overall IMF sort of way to deal with countries that end up in such a situation. So that was why we alluded and only alluded to the IMF in our scenarios, yeah, and didn't mention the Troika or the Commission or the World Bank, yeah. So, and you're also right. I mean, when countries implement austerity, yes, they are under pressure. Yeah, so from financial markets, as we see, we repeatedly seen in Italy, but also other countries, or in Spain in the run-up to the implementation of the euro, where Spain implemented a series of austerity measures without the help, obviously, without the help or of the IMF, but with the pressure of let's say, the implicit pressure, if you wish, or the wish of the Spanish government or Spanish economy to be part of this project, yeah. So yes, there is no doubt that there is the pressure comes from somewhere, but in the end, usually austerity was not as huge or not mandated, or the situation was not as bad as it was, particularly in Ireland, in Spain, but also in Greece, where the whole financial system or the monetary union was about to collapse, right? So there is more autonomy and authority over whether or not you want to engage. So I do think that in this sense there is a difference, yeah, in these cases. But we do not. It's difficult to model this counterfactual scenario and really make a clean cut, yeah. It's difficult in observational setting, and it remains a challenge, I think, also in an experimental setup.
We still have a bit of time until 2 o'clock if someone would like to ask further questions or come back to some points? Or if you would like to say some concluding remarks? Or...
No, that was, I mean, these are very good comments, and I think they come at the right point because the paper was sort of dormant, lying around, and we are at the point where we would like to make a jump and some progress. So these are good comments that we will discuss together with Marcus, and then hopefully present, or you will see another version that is based on some of your comments that we got here. So thanks a lot for bearing with us, and yeah, looking forward to next seminar.